In the spring of 1944, beneath the vated stone ceiling of a centuries-old convent in Rome, a group of nuns gathered for evening prayers. Their voices rose in sacred hymns, filling the chapel with the familiar sound of devotion. But hidden among them, kneeling in the choir stalls and draped in borrowed habits, were men who had never taken vows. Men who wore rosaries around their necks instead of dog tags. Men whose hands were calloused, not from decades of prayer, but from handling rifles and grenades. These were Allied soldiers, escapees from prisoner-of-war camps, fugitives hunted by the Nazi occupiers who controlled every street corner of the Eternal City. And standing at the front of this dangerous masquerade, her face calm and her eyes sharp with calculated defiance, was a woman whose name would be buried in the footnotes of history. A woman who turned her house of God into a fortress of deception. Her name was Mother Mary St. Luke, and what she did in those final months before Rome's liberation was nothing short of extraordinary. Rome in 1944 was a city caught between two worlds. The Germans had occupied it since September of the previous year after Italy's sudden surrender to the Allies sent shockwaves through the Axis powers. Hitler's forces swept down from the north, turning Rome into a garrison city, a strategic prize too valuable to abandon and too symbolic to lose without a fight. The streets that had once bustled with pilgrims and merchants now echoed with the sound of jack boots on cobblestones and the growl of military vehicles rumbling past ancient ruins. Checkpoints appeared on every major thoroughfare. Curfews were enforced with brutal efficiency, and anyone caught harboring enemy soldiers faced immediate execution. No trial, no mercy. Just a bullet and a shallow grave. For the ordinary Romans trapped in this nightmare, survival meant keeping your head down, your mouth shut, and your neighbors at arm's length, because trust could get you killed. But Mother Mary St. Luke was not an ordinary Roman. She was the abbess of a small Franciscan convent, tucked away in one of the city's quieter districts, a place that had stood for more than 300 years, weathering plagues and wars, and the slow erosion of time itself. She was a woman in her 50s, born into a respectable Italian family, educated in theology and Latin, and hardened by decades of managing a community of women in a world that often dismissed them. She was not a firebrand or a revolutionary. She was methodical, disciplined, and deeply practical. She understood that the greatest acts of resistance were not always the loudest. Sometimes they were whispered in confession, hidden in plain sight, and executed with the precision of a military operation disguised as charity. When the first Allied soldier stumbled to her convent door in the winter of 1943, wounded and desperate, she did not hesitate. She took him in, knowing full well what it would cost her if she was discovered. The soldier was British, a prisoner who had escaped during a chaotic transfer between camps. He had been on the run for weeks, sleeping in ditches and stealing food from farms, always one step ahead of the patrols that scoured the countryside for men like him. He was exhausted, half-starved, and suffering from an infected leg wound that needed immediate attention. Mother Mary hid him in the convent cellar, a damp stone chamber filled with old wine barrels and forgotten relics. She cleaned his wound herself, using what little medical knowledge she had gleaned from years of tending to sick nuns and injured locals. She fed him soup made from vegetables grown in the convent garden, and bread baked in the communal oven. And when he was strong enough to walk again, she did not send him away. Instead, she made a decision that would define the rest of her war. She would turn her convent into a sanctuary, a hidden refuge for Allied soldiers trapped behind enemy lines. Word spread quietly through the Roman underground, that fragile network of partisans, sympathetic priests and ordinary citizens who risked everything to help the Allies. If you were a British or American soldier on the run, if you had nowhere else to go and no one else to trust, there was a convent on the outskirts of the city where the abbeys would take you in. One by one they came. Some arrived alone, others in small groups, guided by partisan couriers who knew the back alleys and safe houses. By the spring of 1944, Mother Mary was hiding more than a dozen men inside the convent walls. A growing roster of fugitives whose presence put every single nun under her care in mortal danger. She knew the risks. She had heard the stories of what the Nazis did to those who defied them, the public executions, the reprisals against entire neighborhoods, the brutal interrogations in the basement of the Gestapo headquarters. But she also knew something else. something that kept her awake at night and drove her forward with unwavering resolve. If she did nothing, these men would die. And she refused to let that happen on her watch. The problem was simple, but terrifying. How do you hide a dozen grown men in a place where German patrols could arrive at any moment? Where neighbors might notice unusual activity? Where a single mistake could unravel everything? Mother Mary's solution was as audacious as it was absurd. She dressed them as nuns. She gave them habits to wear, rosaries to carry, and instructions on how to walk, how to sit, and how to keep their heads bowed during prayers. She taught them the rhythms of convent life, the schedules of morning mass and evening vespers, the quiet routines that would make them invisible in plain sight. And when the German soldiers came knocking, as they inevitably did, demanding to search the premises or question the residents, she led them through the convent with the calm authority of a woman who had nothing to hide, pointing out the chapel, the refectory, the dormitories, all while her fake nuns knelt in the choir stalls, their faces obscured by veils, their voices murmuring prayers in Latin they had memorized phonetically, hoping to God that no one looked too closely. The deception required more than just costumes and prayers. It demanded an almost theatrical attention to detail, a performance so convincing that even the most suspicious Nazi officer would see nothing but a community of devout women going about their sacred duties. Mother Mary understood this instinctively. She knew that the moment one of her disguised soldiers made eye contact with a German, the moment one of them walked with the wrong gait or forgot to keep his hands folded properly, the entire operation would collapse. So she drilled them relentlessly. She taught them how to lower their voices when speaking, how to move with the slow, deliberate grace that nuns cultivated over years of monastic discipline. She showed them where to place their hands during prayer, how to genuflect without drawing attention, and most importantly, how to remain absolutely still and silent when danger was near. The convent became a stage, and every soldier and actor playing the role of his life. But the disguises alone were not enough to protect them from the increasing German presence in Rome. By early 1944, the Nazi occupation had tightened its grip on the city. The Gestapo was conducting house-to-house searches with brutal efficiency, hunting for partisans, Jews, and escaped prisoners of war. Informants were everywhere, motivated by fear or greed, or simply the desire to survive in a world where betrayal was often rewarded and loyalty punished. The convent had already received multiple visits from German patrols, officers who walked through the hallways with cold eyes, asking questions about the number of residents, the convent's daily routines, and whether anyone had noticed suspicious activity in the neighborhood. Each time Mother Mary met them with serene composure, offering them wine from the convent stores, and explaining in her careful Italian that her nuns were simple women dedicated to prayer and charity, nothing more. And each time the soldiers left without discovering the truth, hidden in plain sight. The most dangerous moments came during mandatory inspections, when German officers would arrive unannounced and demand to see every room, every face, every corner of the building. Mother Mary had developed a system for these encounters. When the knock came at the gate, a designated nun would delay the visitors at the entrance, offering them refreshments and engaging them in polite conversation, while another nun rushed through the building alerting the hidden soldiers. The men would quickly take their positions in the chapel choir, donning their habits and veils, arranging themselves among the genuine nuns who had volunteered to help shield them. By the time the Germans entered the chapel, they would find what appeared to be a full complement of sisters engaged in their daily devotions, voices raised in hymns, faces obscured by the shadows of their veils. The officers would walk between the pews, sometimes stopping to observe the women at prayer, their suspicions aroused by nothing more concrete than instinct or rumor. And Mother Mary would stand at the altar leading the prayers with unwavering confidence, her heart pounding but her voice steady. The psychological toll on everyone involved was immense. The genuine nuns lived in constant fear, knowing that their abbess's decision to shelter these men had placed them all under a death sentence should the truth emerge. Some of them had family in Rome, children and elderly parents who would suffer reprisals if the convent was exposed. Yet they remained loyal, driven by their faith, their respect for Mother Mary's authority, and perhaps most powerfully, by their own sense of moral duty. They understood that these soldiers were someone's sons, someone's husbands, men who had fought against tyranny, and now depended on the courage of strangers for their survival. The soldiers themselves struggled with guilt and helplessness, acutely aware that their presence endangered the women who protected them. They were warriors reduced to playing the part of silent, passive observers, forced to trust their lives to an elderly abbess and her community of nuns while the war raged beyond the convent walls. Yet despite the constant danger, despite the fear that permeated every moment of every day, life inside the convent continued with remarkable normalcy. The nuns maintained their schedules of prayer, work, and study. They tended the garden, baked bread, mended clothes, and cared for the poor who came to their gates seeking food or medicine. The disguised soldiers participated in these routines, learning to knead dough, to pull weeds, to scrub floors, all while keeping their heads down and their identities concealed. In the evenings, when the gates were locked and the windows shuttered, Mother Mary would sometimes allow them to gather in the cellar where they could speak freely in English, share news from the BBC broadcasts that a sympathetic priest smuggled into the convent on scraps of paper, and remind themselves that somewhere beyond the occupied city, their comrades were fighting to liberate Rome. Those moments of fellowship were brief but vital, small islands of hope in an ocean of uncertainty. The spring of 1944 brought both hope and heightened danger to Rome. The Allied forces were advancing up the Italian peninsula, having landed at Anzio in January, and now locked in a brutal stalemate with German defenders who refused to yield ground. Every day the thunder of distant artillery grew slightly louder, a reminder that liberation was coming, but still agonizingly far away. For the people of Rome, this period of waiting was perhaps the most dangerous of all. The Germans, sensing that their hold on the city was slipping, became more paranoid and more violent. Random shootings increased. Mass arrests swept through neighborhoods suspected of harboring partisans. The Gestapo's torture chambers worked overtime, extracting names and addresses from prisoners who could no longer endure the pain. And the SS began conducting more frequent raids on churches, monasteries, and convents, places that had traditionally enjoyed a measure of protection under the unwritten rules of occupation, but were now viewed as potential hiding places for enemies of the Reich. Mother Mary knew that time was running out. The convent had been fortunate so far. Its remote location and the Abbess's careful management had kept it off the Gestapo's priority list. But she understood that fortune was a fickle thing in wartime, and that eventually, inevitably, someone would talk. Perhaps a neighbor who had noticed too many shadows moving behind the convent walls at odd hours. Perhaps an informant who had heard whispers about the abbeys who sheltered Allied soldiers. Perhaps simply bad luck. A routine patrol that decided to be more thorough than usual. She began making contingency plans, identifying escape routes through the convent's ancient network of cellars and tunnels, some of which dated back to the building's construction in the 17th century. She established signals with trusted partisans outside, coded messages that could be passed through the convent's legitimate visitors, warning her if the Germans were planning a major sweep through her district. And she drilled her nuns and the hidden soldiers even more rigorously, running practice evacuations in the dead of night, timing how quickly they could move from the dormitories to the hidden chambers beneath the chapel floor. The crisis came on a warm morning in April. A black sedan pulled up to the convent gate, followed by a truck carrying a dozen SS soldiers in full combat gear. This was not a routine inspection. The officer who emerged from the sedan was a Gestapo captain known throughout Rome for his ruthless efficiency. A man who had personally overseen the execution of dozens of partisans, and who took particular pleasure in rooting out hidden enemies. He had received a tip. He informed Mother Mary with cold politeness that her convent was harboring fugitives. He intended to conduct a complete search of the premises room by room, and he expected full cooperation. Any resistance, any attempt to obstruct his investigation would result in the immediate arrest of everyone in the building. Mother Mary listened to his words with outward calm, her hands folded serenely in front of her, her face betraying nothing of the terror that gripped her heart. She nodded graciously, told him that, of course, he and his men were welcome to search wherever they wished, and offered to personally guide them through the convent to ensure they missed nothing. As the Gestapo captain assembled his men in the courtyard, issuing instructions in sharp German commands, one of the younger nuns slipped away and rushed through the building's back corridors. She moved with practiced speed, knocking on specific doors in a predetermined pattern, the signal they had rehearsed countless times. Within minutes, the hidden soldiers were moving from their various hiding places toward the chapel. They donned their habits with trembling hands, adjusted their veils to ensure maximum coverage of their faces, and took their positions in the choir stalls. The genuine nuns joined them, forming a protective buffer, their bodies positioned strategically to obscure any telltale details that might give away the deception. They began singing a hymn, their voices rising in perfect harmony, filling the chapel with a sound so pure and holy that it seemed impossible anything sinister could be happening within those sacred walls. And Mother Mary, having stalled the Gestapo captain with offers of refreshment and polite conversation, finally led him and his soldiers toward the chapel, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether her gamble had been brilliant or suicidal. The chapel doors swung open, and the German soldiers entered with rifles at the ready, their eyes scanning the space with professional suspicion. The captain walked slowly down the center aisle, his boots echoing on the ancient stone floor, his gaze moving from one veiled figure to another. The nuns continued their hymn without faltering, their voices steady despite the armed men now surrounding them. Mother Mary positioned herself near the altar, her posture relaxed, her expression one of mild curiosity, as if she genuinely could not understand why these officers seemed so tense in the presence of women at prayer. The captain stopped in the middle of the aisle, listening to the singing, watching the rows of identical figures in their black habits and white veils. He turned to Mother Mary and asked her a question that made her blood run cold. He wanted to see their faces, every single one of them. He wanted them to remove their veils so his men could verify their identities against the convent's official roster. Mother Mary felt the weight of that moment settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. Every eye in the chapel, hidden and visible alike, turned toward her, waiting to see how she would respond to this demand that could unravel everything in seconds. She had anticipated searches, questions, even suspicions, but she had gambled that the Germans would respect the sanctity of prayer, that they would be reluctant to disrupt a religious ceremony or force nuns to break their devotional silence. She had miscalculated. This Gestapo captain was not a man constrained by tradition or religious reverence. He was a hunter who had caught the scent of prey, and he intended to see this through to the end. Mother Mary took a slow breath, her mind racing through possibilities, and then she did something that would become legendary among those who survived to tell the story. She smiled, a gentle, almost maternal smile. And she told the captain that of course he could see their faces, but she must respectfully ask that he allow the sisters to finish their current hymn first, as interrupting prayer midway was considered deeply disrespectful to God, and she would not want to bring such dishonor upon her house or upon the captain himself, who she was certain was a man of principle and faith. The captain paused, caught off guard by her tone, which managed to be both accommodating and subtly reproachful. He was a predator accustomed to fear, to stammering denials and desperate pleading, not to this calm, almost grandmotherly concern for propriety and divine respect. He glanced at his men, then back at the singing nuns, calculating whether this was a delaying tactic or simply the stubbornness of a religious woman clinging to her rituals, even in the face of military authority. Mother Mary pressed her advantage, stepping closer to him and speaking in a lower voice, explaining that many of these sisters had taken vows of enclosure and had not shown their faces to men outside the clergy in decades, that forcing them to do so abruptly would cause them great spiritual distress, perhaps even psychological harm. She suggested with perfect reasonableness that perhaps the captain's men could check the convent's records instead, comparing the official roster against the number of women present, which would be far more efficient and would spare everyone unnecessary discomfort. She was offering him a way out, a solution that would satisfy his orders without requiring him to commit what might be seen as an act of religious violation. The captain's jaw tightened. He was not a fool, and he sensed that he was being manipulated, but he also understood the political reality of occupied Rome. The Catholic Church still wielded considerable influence even under Nazi control, and stories of Gestapo officers desecrating religious institutions had a way of causing diplomatic complications that his superiors found tiresome. He made a decision, perhaps out of pragmatism, perhaps out of some lingering vestige of his own Catholic upbringing. He would allow the hymn to finish, but then he wanted every nun to step forward individually, state her name, and be checked against the official list. No exceptions, no delays. Mother Mary thanked him graciously, as if he had just granted her a tremendous favor, and she returned to her position near the altar, giving an almost imperceptible nod to the nun leading the choir. The signal was understood. The hymn that was being sung, a traditional Latin piece that normally lasted 3 minutes, was quietly extended, verses repeated. The tempo slowed just slightly, buying precious seconds for what came next. While the Germans stood watching, while the music filled the chapel with its haunting beauty, something extraordinary was happening beneath the surface of that apparent tranquility. Several of the genuine nuns, positioned strategically among the disguised soldiers, began a carefully orchestrated movement. They shifted in their seats, creating momentary gaps in the visual field, small blind spots that allowed some of the men to slip backward, moving with agonizing slowness from the front rows toward the rear of the choir. Other nuns moved forward to fill the spaces, maintaining the appearance of an unchanged congregation. It was a shell game played with human lives, a desperate improvisation executed with the precision of a military maneuver. Mother Mary had not planned for this specific scenario, but her nuns had developed their own instincts over months of living with this secret, and they were acting on those instincts now, protecting the men who had become their responsibility, their brothers in this shared ordeal. As the hymn reached its final verse, Mother Mary walked to the front of the choir and began calling names from memory, beckoning specific nuns to come forward. She called only women she knew were genuine members of her community, women whose faces the Germans could scrutinize without consequence. One by one, they stepped forward, lowered their veils briefly to show their faces, stated their names, and returned to their places. The Gestapo soldiers checked each name against the roster, their expressions growing less suspicious with each confirmation. The captain watched this process, his frustration evident, because everything appeared to be exactly as Mother Mary had claimed. Just nuns, just prayer, just another religious community going about its tedious devotions. After the 15th name was called and verified, he raised his hand, stopping the process. He had seen enough. Either his information had been wrong, or whoever had been hiding here had already fled. He ordered his men to search the rest of the building, the cellars, the dormitories, the storage rooms, but his tone had lost its edge. He no longer believed he would find anything. The German soldiers spent the next 2 hours tearing through the convent with methodical brutality. They overturned beds, emptied closets, pried open storage chests, and probed the walls for hidden compartments. They descended into the cellars with flashlights, examining every corner, every shadow, every space large enough to conceal a human being. They questioned the nuns who remained in the dormitories, asking about unusual noises, strange visitors, anything that might confirm the tip their captain had received. But they found nothing, because the men they were hunting for were still sitting in the chapel choir, their hearts pounding, their muscles rigid with tension, maintaining their poses as the search raged through the building around them. Mother Mary had understood something fundamental about human psychology. The Germans had already looked in the chapel. They had already examined the nuns gathered there, and having found nothing suspicious on their first inspection, they were unlikely to return and check again. People see what they expect to see. And the Gestapo expected hidden fugitives to be cowering in cellars or concealed behind false walls, not sitting in plain sight among a congregation of singing women. When the search finally concluded and the Gestapo captain gathered his men in the courtyard, his mood was dark. He had wasted an entire morning on what appeared to be false intelligence, and he would have to report his failure to superiors, who did not appreciate wasted time or resources. He turned to Mother Mary, who had accompanied him throughout the search with patient cooperation, and told her curtly that she and her nuns were fortunate this time, but that he would be watching the convent closely, and if he received any further reports of suspicious activity, he would not be so courteous in his next visit. Mother Mary accepted his words with the same serene composure she had maintained throughout the ordeal, assuring him that her doors were always open to the authorities, that she had nothing to hide, and that she prayed daily for peace and for the safety of all soldiers regardless of which side they fought for. It was a masterful performance, blending just enough deference to avoid antagonizing him with just enough dignity to maintain her authority. The captain climbed into his sedan, and the convoy of German vehicles pulled away from the convent gate, leaving behind a community that had just survived its closest brush with annihilation. The moment the vehicles disappeared around the corner, the carefully maintained facade crumbled. Several of the nuns collapsed into chairs, their bodies shaking with delayed shock. Others wept quietly, releasing the terror they had suppressed for hours. The disguised soldiers remained frozen in the choir for several more minutes, unable to believe they were still alive, still undiscovered. Mother Mary stood at the chapel entrance, her back straight, her hands steady. But those who knew her well could see the tremor in her fingers, the paleness of her face, the cost of the performance she had just delivered. She had gambled with all their lives, and she had won. But the victory felt less like triumph and more like borrowed time. She knew that the Gestapo captain's suspicions had not been fully dispelled, only temporarily frustrated. He would be back, or someone like him would be back, and next time they might not be so fortunate. That night, after evening prayers, Mother Mary gathered her entire community in the refectory, genuine nuns and hidden soldiers alike. She told them that what had happened that morning could not happen again, that their luck had run out, and that they needed to find another solution. Some of the soldiers volunteered to leave immediately to take their chances on the streets rather than continue endangering the women who had protected them. But Mother Mary refused to consider it. The German patrols were more active than ever. The partisan networks were compromised, and sending these men out into occupied Rome now would be sending them to their deaths. Instead, she proposed something even more audacious. They would not simply hide the soldiers anymore. They would integrate them so completely into the convent's daily life that they would become invisible, not through concealment, but through normalization. The soldiers would no longer retreat to hidden rooms when visitors came. They would be present, visible, active, participating fully in the convent's routines. They would become in every observable way members of the religious community they were pretending to join. Over the following weeks, this transformation took place with remarkable thoroughness. The soldiers learned not just to look like nuns, but to act like them in every detail. They studied the prayers, memorized the rituals, practiced the habits of silence and contemplation that defined monastic life. They worked in the garden, harvested vegetables, helped with the cooking and cleaning, attended every service, every communal meal, every moment of the daily schedule. Some of them discovered unexpected aptitudes for this life. A British sergeant who had been a farmer before the war found peace in tending the convent's vegetable plots, his hands remembering the feel of soil and the rhythm of planting seasons. An American corporal who had sung in his church choir back home discovered that his voice blended beautifully with the nuns' harmonies, adding depth to their hymns. They were still soldiers, still warriors waiting for liberation. But they were also becoming something else. Something neither military nor monastic, but uniquely their own. A brotherhood born of necessity and sustained by the courage of the women who refused to abandon them. As April gave way to May, the sounds of war grew closer to Rome with each passing day. The Allied bombardment of German positions in the surrounding hills became a constant background noise, a rhythmic thunder that shook the convent walls and rattled the ancient stained glass windows. At night, the horizon glowed orange with distant fires, and the people of Rome whispered to each other in darkened doorways about how long it would be before the Americans arrived, whether the Germans would fight for the city street by street, whether liberation would come as salvation or as devastation. Inside the convent, the strange hybrid community that Mother Mary had created continued its daily routines with almost defiant normalcy. The disguised soldiers had become so integrated into the convent's life that visitors who came seeking charity or spiritual counsel saw nothing unusual, just a community of nuns going about their ancient practices, seemingly untouched by the chaos consuming the world beyond their walls. But beneath that carefully maintained surface, everyone was acutely aware that they were living on borrowed time. The strain was beginning to show in ways both subtle and profound. Several of the nuns developed stress-related illnesses, mysterious fevers, and stomach ailments that defied simple remedies. One of the younger sisters suffered what would today be recognized as a nervous breakdown, becoming convinced that the Gestapo had planted listening devices in the chapel walls and refusing to speak above a whisper for days. The soldiers, for their part, struggled with the enforced passivity of their situation. They were trained warriors reduced to playing domestic roles, men of action forced into contemplation, fighters who could only wait while others fought the battles that would determine their fate. Some channeled their frustration into the physical labor of maintaining the convent, throwing themselves into repairs and improvements with almost manic energy. Others retreated inward, spending hours in the chapel in genuine prayer, seeking some kind of meaning or purpose in their strange exile from the war. Mother Mary moved among them all, nun and soldier alike, offering comfort, maintaining discipline, and somehow holding together a community that should have fractured under the pressure, but instead grew stronger through shared adversity. The second major crisis came on a morning in late May, when a German military policeman arrived at the convent gate with an unusual request. The Wehrmacht was requisitioning buildings throughout Rome to house troops being pulled back from the front lines, and the convent had been identified as a suitable location due to its size and relative isolation. An advance team would arrive within 48 hours to assess the facilities and determine how many soldiers could be billeted there. The convent would not be closed, the officer explained with bureaucratic politeness, but it would need to accommodate a German military presence for the foreseeable future. Mother Mary listened to this announcement with growing horror, understanding immediately what it meant. There was no way to hide a dozen Allied soldiers in a building occupied by German troops. The disguises that had fooled occasional visitors and brief inspections would never survive the scrutiny of men living alongside them day after day. Discovery would be inevitable, and when it came, it would mean execution for everyone involved. She had 48 hours to solve an impossible problem, and she began by doing what she had always done best. She bought time. That afternoon, she sent a message through her partisan contacts to a sympathetic priest who had connections within the Vatican bureaucracy. By evening, she had secured a meeting with a mid-level church official who owed the convent a favor from earlier in the war. She explained her situation in carefully coded language, never explicitly admitting what she was hiding, but making clear that the German requisition would create catastrophic consequences. The official, a shrewd political operator who had survived decades of navigating between secular and religious power, understood what was being asked of him. He promised to intervene, to use the Vatican's diplomatic influence to have the requisition order rescinded or at least delayed. But he warned Mother Mary that such interventions took time, that the Church's leverage with the German occupiers was waning as the military situation deteriorated, and that she should not count on miracles. She thanked him for his honesty and returned to the convent to prepare for the worst. That night, Mother Mary assembled her council of senior nuns and laid out the situation with brutal clarity. The partisan networks could possibly smuggle out 1 or 2 soldiers, but not a dozen, and not in 48 hours. The soldiers could not simply walk out the front gate as the neighborhood was under constant surveillance. They could not hide in the cellars or tunnels, as the German advance team would certainly search those spaces, as part of their assessment. The only option that offered any real chance of success was the one that terrified her most. They would need to move the soldiers out of Rome entirely, not through the partisan networks, but through the one route that the Germans still allowed to function with minimal interference, the route used by church officials traveling between Rome and the Vatican. It would require forged documents, church vehicles, clerical disguises, and most critically, it would require the cooperation of people outside the convent who could be arrested and executed if anything went wrong. It was audacious to the point of madness. But Mother Mary had learned over these long months that audacity was sometimes the only rational response to impossible circumstances. They would turn these soldiers into traveling priests, and they would drive them through German checkpoints in broad daylight, trusting in the lingering respect that even the Nazis maintained for religious authority. The plan that Mother Mary devised over the next 24 hours was built on layers of deception, each one dependent on the success of the one before it. The soldiers would no longer be nuns, but priests, specifically Franciscan friars, traveling to a monastery outside Rome to deliver supplies and collect documents. The transformation would be easier in some ways, as the friars' brown robes and hooded cowls provided more coverage than the nuns' habits, and the soldiers would not need to alter their voices or movements as dramatically. But it was also more dangerous because priests moved through the world in ways that nuns did not, interacting with German checkpoints, engaging in conversations, producing identification papers that would be scrutinized far more carefully. Mother Mary reached out through her network to a forger, who had been creating false documents for the Roman underground since the first days of occupation. He worked in the back room of a bookshop near the Pantheon, a wizened old man whose hands shook from age, but whose work was flawless. She provided him with photographs of the soldiers taken in dim light to obscure their features, along with names of real priests who had died earlier in the war and whose deaths had not been properly recorded in the chaos of occupation. Within 36 hours, the forger delivered a set of identity cards and travel permits that could withstand all but the most intensive examination. Each document bore official stamps, signatures that matched those in German records, and details that corresponded to real monasteries and real church administrative procedures. The soldiers studied these documents obsessively, memorizing every detail, rehearsing the stories they would tell if questioned. They practiced their Italian accents, learned basic religious phrases, and were drilled by the more educated nuns on Catholic theology, in case a suspicious German officer decided to test their knowledge. The British sergeant, who had studied Latin in school, became their spokesman, the one who would do most of the talking at checkpoints. The others were instructed to remain silent, heads bowed in contemplation, allowing their colleague to handle any interactions. They rehearsed the scenario dozens of times with nuns playing the roles of suspicious guards, asking aggressive questions, demanding to see papers, creating the kind of stressful confrontation they might face on the road. The vehicle that would carry them out of Rome was provided by a sympathetic priest who served as a liaison between various religious communities in the region. It was a battered delivery truck with faded church markings on its sides, the kind of vehicle that had made the journey between Rome and the countryside countless times, carrying everything from altar wine to medical supplies to refugees seeking shelter. The priest himself would drive, his presence lending credibility to the mission and providing experienced navigation through the checkpoint system that had grown increasingly complex as the Germans fortified their defensive positions around the city. He was a man in his 60s, soft-spoken and unassuming, who had been quietly assisting the resistance for years, using his clerical status as both shield and weapon against the occupation. He knew which guards at which checkpoints were lazy, which ones were zealous, which ones could be distracted with small talk about the weather or complaints about rationing. This knowledge would be their greatest asset on a journey that should take 2 hours, but might take 6 or more if they encountered delays. The morning of the evacuation arrived with lean skies and the distant rumble of artillery that had become Rome's constant soundtrack. The soldiers dressed in their friar robes for the final time, adjusting the rough, brown fabric, pulling the hoods low over their faces. They looked convincing enough in the dim light of the convent's corridors, but Mother Mary knew that daylight would be less forgiving, that their military bearing would be harder to conceal in the unforgiving clarity of a Roman morning. She gathered them in the chapel one last time, not for a formal prayer service, but for something more personal, more human. She told them that what they had endured together over these months had been extraordinary, that their courage and patience had been equal to that of any soldier on any battlefield, and that when they returned to their units, when they told the stories of their time behind enemy lines, they should remember the nuns who had risked everything for men they had never met and would likely never see again. Several of the soldiers wept openly, overcome by the emotion of leaving this strange sanctuary that had become more home than prison. The truck was loaded with actual church supplies to provide cover for the journey. Crates of wine and communion wafers and hymnals stacked carefully in the back. The soldiers climbed aboard, settling themselves among the cargo, their faces shadowed by their hoods, their hands folded in attitudes of prayer. The driver started the engine, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet courtyard, and Mother Mary blessed them all with the sign of the cross, her lips moving in a prayer that was both ancient ritual and desperate plea. The truck rolled through the convent gate and onto the street, joining the sparse morning traffic, just another church vehicle going about its business in occupied Rome. Mother Mary watched it disappear around the corner, her heart heavy with fear and hope in equal measure, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether her audacious gamble had been brilliant strategy or fatal miscalculation. She returned to the chapel and knelt before the altar, doing the only thing left for her to do. She prayed. The truck made it through the first 2 checkpoints without incident. The guards were young, vermicharked soldiers, bored and exhausted from weeks of retreat and defensive duty, who barely glanced at the papers before waving them through. The driver made small talk about the unseasonable cold, about rumors that the Allies were bogged down in the mountains, about anything that would create a sense of normalcy and routine. In the back of the truck, the disguised soldiers sat in absolute silence, their bodies tense, their breathing shallow, listening to the muffled conversations outside, and trying to interpret every pause, every change in tone. They had been trained for combat, for the chaos of battle, where fear could be channeled into action. But this passive vulnerability was a different kind of warfare, one that required them to do nothing, to simply trust in the deception and wait for either safety or discovery. The truck rumbled on through the outskirts of Rome, passing bombed-out buildings and German military convoys heading toward the front lines, a city caught between one age and the next. The third checkpoint was different. It was manned by SS troops rather than regular army, and the officer in charge was a veteran who had survived the Eastern Front and carried that experience in the hard lines of his face and the suspicious set of his eyes. He ordered the driver out of the cab and demanded to see not just travel papers, but the full inventory of cargo. The priest complied with calm efficiency, handing over documents that listed every crate in the back of the truck, explaining that he was delivering supplies to a monastery that served as a field hospital for wounded civilians. The SS officer studied the papers with meticulous attention, comparing them against a list of authorized religious transports, looking for any discrepancy that might justify a more thorough search. Behind him, his soldiers watched with the casual alertness of men who had learned to trust their instincts, men who knew that smugglers and partisans used every kind of disguise, including religious ones. The priest maintained his composure, answering questions with the weary patience of someone who had dealt with bureaucratic obstacles countless times before. Then the SS officer did something that sent ice through the driver's veins. He walked to the back of the truck and ordered his men to open it. He wanted to see the cargo himself to verify that it matched the inventory. The soldiers lowered the tailgate, and the officer climbed into the truck bed, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, his flashlight cutting through the shadows between the crates. The disguised Allied soldiers remained absolutely motionless, their heads bowed in prayer postures, their faces hidden by their hoods, every muscle frozen in place. The SS officer swept his light across them, counting silently, then turned his attention to the crates, prying open several to examine the contents. He found exactly what the inventory claimed: bottles of sacramental wine, boxes of wafers, stacks of prayer books. Nothing suspicious, nothing out of place, but something still bothered him, some instinct honed by years of hunting enemies who specialized in deception. He turned back to the silent figures seated among the cargo, and asked them a direct question in German, demanding to know where they were traveling from and why they were not riding in the cab with the driver. The British sergeant, the one who had been designated as spokesman, responded in slow, deliberate Italian, explaining that he and his brothers preferred to ride in the back to continue their prayers undisturbed, that the noise of the engine made contemplation difficult in the cab. He spoke with the careful pronunciation of someone who had learned the language from books and teachers. His accent unmistakably foreign, but plausibly that of a northern Italian, or perhaps someone from the Alpine regions. The SS officer stared at him for a long moment, his flashlight beam fixed on the hooded face, trying to penetrate the shadows and see what was hidden there. He asked another question, this time about which monastery they were affiliated with, which superior had authorized their journey. The sergeant answered smoothly, providing the name of a real monastery and a real abbot, details that Mother Mary and her forger had carefully researched and prepared. The officer's suspicion began to waver, not disappearing, but losing its sharp edge, because everything about this scene appeared legitimate, tedious, even just another group of religious men going about their incomprehensible devotions in the middle of a war. But the moment was not over yet. The SS officer reached out suddenly and grabbed the sergeant's hood, pulling it back to expose his face to the light. It was the moment they had all dreaded, the instant when disguise would either hold or shatter. The sergeant looked up at the German with calm, steady eyes, his face composed, showing neither fear nor aggression, just the mild curiosity of a priest interrupted in his prayers. The officer studied that face, looking for something, some sign of deception, some telltale marker that would confirm his instincts. What he saw was a man in his 30s with a beard grown long and unkempt in the monastic style, skin weathered by outdoor labor, eyes that held both exhaustion and a kind of peaceful resignation. He saw what he expected to see, because the sergeant had spent months living the role, because the physical transformation was complete, and because sometimes the most effective lies are the ones built on foundations of truth. The officer released the hood, letting it fall back into place, and turned away. He ordered his men to close the truck and wave them through. They had passed the final test. The truck continued its journey away from Rome, climbing into the hills where the air grew cooler, and the sounds of war became more distant, reduced to a faint echo that might have been thunder or imagination. The soldiers in the back did not speak, did not move, did not allow themselves to believe they were safe until the driver called back through the window, separating the cab from the cargo area, his voice cracking with relief, telling them they had crossed into territory controlled by partisan forces, that the next checkpoint would be manned by friends rather than enemies. Only then did the men allow themselves to breathe fully, to pull back their hoods, and look at each other with expressions that mixed disbelief, exhaustion, and overwhelming gratitude. They had survived. Against impossible odds, through a gauntlet of checkpoints and suspicion, and moments when discovery seemed inevitable, they had survived. The British sergeant who had faced down the SS officer began to shake, delayed shock finally overtaking him, and his companions gripped his shoulders, holding him steady, sharing the burden of what they had all just endured together. The monastery where they were delivered was a genuine religious community that had been cooperating with the partisan networks for months, providing shelter, medical care, and intelligence to the resistance fighters operating in the mountains. The abbot was a shrewd old man who understood exactly what kind of cargo the truck had brought him, and he welcomed the soldiers with quiet efficiency, leading them to a secure wing of the building, where they could rest and recover before being moved again through the partisan underground railroad toward Allied lines. The driver stayed only long enough to unload the legitimate supplies, and received confirmation that his passengers had been safely delivered. Then he climbed back into his truck and began the dangerous return journey to Rome. He carried with him messages from the soldiers to Mother Mary, words of thanks that seemed inadequate for what she had done, but were all they had to offer. By nightfall, the truck was back in the city, and the driver made his way to the convent to deliver the news that Mother Mary had been waiting for with barely controlled anxiety. They were safe, all of them. The mission had succeeded, but the celebration at the convent was muted, because the danger was far from over. The German advance team still arrived as scheduled the next morning to assess the building for military billeting, and Mother Mary had to conduct yet another performance, showing them through rooms that had been hastily cleaned of any evidence of the soldiers who had occupied them just days before. The Germans found the convent acceptable for their purposes, and informed her that troops would begin arriving within the week. Mother Mary accepted this news with outward grace, while her mind raced through calculations of how to manage this new impossibility. This forced cohabitation with the very soldiers she had been deceiving for months. But fate intervened in a way no one could have predicted. 2 days later, on June 4, 1944, the American Fifth Army entered Rome. The German forces, rather than fight for the city as feared, withdrew northward to new defensive lines, abandoning Rome to the Allies, without the devastating urban battle everyone had dreaded. The liberation came so suddenly that it felt almost anticlimactic. One day the streets were filled with German patrols and the atmosphere heavy with occupation, and the next American tanks were rolling past the Colosseum while Roman citizens poured into the streets waving makeshift flags and weeping with relief. Mother Mary and her nuns emerged from the convent to find their neighborhood transformed, American soldiers distributing chocolate and cigarettes to children, jeeps decorated with flowers, a spontaneous celebration erupting across the city. For the first time in 9 months, the abbess allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had carried. The burden of decisions that could have resulted in massacres. The terror that had become so constant, she had learned to function despite it. She stood in the convent courtyard, watching the celebration in the streets beyond the gates, and she wept, not from joy or relief, but from sheer exhaustion, from the accumulated strain of months spent walking a tightrope between courage and catastrophe. In the weeks that followed, as order was gradually restored to Rome, and the machinery of military occupation shifted from German to Allied hands, stories began to emerge of what had happened during those dark months. Partisan networks shared their tales. Priests spoke of their underground activities, and ordinary citizens who had hidden Jews or sheltered escaped prisoners began to come forward. Mother Mary's story might have remained just one among many, a footnote in the larger narrative of resistance and survival, except for one thing. The soldiers she had saved did not forget her. The British sergeant who had faced down the SS officer at the checkpoint, the American corporal who had sung in the chapel choir, the dozen men who had spent months disguised as nuns and then as friars. They all made their way back to Rome as soon as they could, bringing with them reporters and photographers, determined that the world would know what this elderly abbess and her community of nuns had done. They told the story of how they had knelt in choir stalls while Gestapo soldiers walked past them, how they had learned to pray in Latin and tend gardens and live as members of a religious community they had never imagined joining. The photographs that emerge from those reunions show Mother Mary standing among the soldiers she saved, her face weathered and weary but composed, her hands folded in front of her, in that characteristic gesture of serene authority. The men tower over her, these young warriors dwarfing the elderly nun. But in every image it is clear who commanded the respect, who held the moral center of the group. The Italian and international press picked up the story, and for a brief moment in the summer of 1944, Mother Mary St. Luke became a symbol of resistance, proof that courage was not the exclusive province of soldiers and partisans, but could be found in the most unexpected places, in the quiet determination of women who chose defiance over safety. She gave a handful of interviews, speaking modestly about what she had done, deflecting praise toward her nuns and the broader network of Romans who had resisted in countless small ways. Then, as quickly as the attention had come, she withdrew from it, returning to the life she had always known, the rhythms of prayer and service that defined her calling. But the world was not ready to let her story fade into obscurity. Not entirely. The soldiers she had saved carried their memories of the convent back to Britain and America, telling their families about the nuns who had dressed them in habits and taught them to pray, about the Abbess who had stared down the Gestapo with nothing but calm conviction and a handful of lies. Some of them maintained correspondence with Mother Mary for years, sending letters at Christmas and Easter, updating her on their lives, their marriages, their children. They invited her to visit to see the countries she had helped liberate, but she always declined, explaining that her place was in Rome, in the convent that had become both fortress and sanctuary during the war. She lived for another 2 decades, dying quietly in 1965 at the age of 73, her passing noted in a few Italian newspapers, but largely unremarked by the wider world that had briefly celebrated her heroism. The convent itself survived into the modern era, though much changed from the building Mother Mary had presided over. The generation of nuns who had lived through the occupation gradually passed away, taking with them the first-hand memories of those terrifying months when every knock at the gate might have meant discovery and death. The story became institutional memory, then legend, then something hazier still, a tale that newer residents knew in outline, but not in the visceral detail of lived experience. By the turn of the 21st century, the convent had been converted into a cultural center, its chapel preserved as a historical site, its corridors filled with exhibits about wartime Rome rather than the prayers of religious women. Visitors can still see the choir stalls where Allied soldiers once knelt in disguise, can walk through the courtyard where the Gestapo truck parked during that terrifying search, can stand in the rooms where impossible decisions were made with quiet courage. Yet despite the preservation efforts, despite the plaques and the occasional documentary, Mother Mary's story remains largely unknown outside of specialized histories of the Italian resistance. She never received the formal recognition that many of her contemporaries earned, no medals from grateful governments, no inclusion in the canon of celebrated war heroes. Perhaps this obscurity would not have bothered her. She was, after all, a woman who had chosen a life of humble service, who had acted not for glory or recognition, but because her faith and her conscience demanded it. She saw men in desperate need, and she responded with the resources available to her, transforming her convent into a stage for one of the war's most audacious deceptions. She understood that the greatest acts of resistance are often the quietest, that heroism does not always announce itself with fanfare, but sometimes whispers through the corridors of history, waiting for someone to listen. The soldiers she saved, those who survived the rest of the war and returned home to build lives in peace, never forgot what she had done for them. In their final years, several of them gave oral history interviews, preserving their memories of the convent, the disguises, the terror of German searches, and the incredible calm of the woman who orchestrated it all. Their testimonies form a remarkable record, a window into a moment when ordinary people were forced to make extraordinary choices, when survival required not just physical courage, but moral clarity, the ability to see what was right and to act on it regardless of the personal cost. Mother Mary St. Luke belongs to that rare category of historical figures who changed the course of individual lives without changing the course of history itself, who saved a dozen men from death, and in doing so demonstrated that even in the darkest moments of human conflict, there remains space for compassion, for ingenuity, and for the kind of courage that does not seek recognition, but simply does what must be done. Her story deserves to be remembered not as a curiosity or a footnote, but as a testament to what becomes possible when principle meets pragmatism, when faith meets action, and when one determined woman decides that some lives are worth any risk to save.